Welcome back to the podcast. I have somebody I haven't had on in almost a year. It is David Pepose. And last time we had him on, it was for Dynamite and a little bit about Speed Racer. This time around, it's all about Speed Racer. David, how you doing? What's been going on? Tell the fans what's up.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for having me. Yeah, things have been great with all things Speed Racer. In fact, the day that we're talking, the first trade paperback just came out today. So you can order that through your local comic shop, pick that up. It collects issues 0 through 6. So our whole first arc of the series, me and artist Davide Tinto. And yeah, Speed Racer, it's just been such a treat to get to work on this book. And yeah, I'm very excited for people to see what we've got coming, especially in issue 8, which is going to be coming out very soon. That where we debut one of the more iconic cars from Speed Racer mythology, the Great Mammoth car. And so that's going to really elevate things in a big way, particularly as far as Speed's ongoing relationship with his love interest slash team owner, Trixie Turnwell. So definitely let your local comic shop know that you want that book because issue 8 is going to be a really fun one.
So last year, Speed Racer was still a bit off, and it's been a year now. Are you surprised with how it's taken off and how it's done or anything like that? Or how do you feel, David?
You always kind of hold your breath. Whenever a new book comes out, you're always curious, how is it going to land? Because it's your approach on one side and your team's approach on one side, and a whole variety of intangibles that are outside of your control in terms of release scheduling and comics industry's various instabilities over the last year and change.
No, really.
So you're always,
Yeah, tell us more.
you're surfing the waves and hoping that you don't crash. And then on the other side of the equation, it's the people that you're appealing to. It's how are the fans responding to things? It's how are the retailers responding to things? How about press in terms of how they're seeing things and force multiplying your own publicity efforts. And there's a lot that you can't really account for, but I think beyond just that kind of inherent risk that goes with putting something creative out into a commercial marketplace, I will say I had a lot of confidence in this book. And I think it comes down to the source material. I think it's iconic. I think it's really engaging for a very primal human reason. Like racing is fun, racing is exciting and dramatic and intense. But also, I knew from the jump we had the right creative team. Dave Tinto, like really, I knew I'd worked with him before on Avengers Unlimited a few years back in Marvel. And I was so taken with his style that when he and I kind of ran into each other right after I had landed the book at New York Comic Con, I was like, hey, what are you doing? Right? What's on your plate right now? Would you have any interest in something like this if I floated your name out? It was really nice that like he was available and able to do it because I knew having him on the book, I was like, okay, like 90% of the work's been done. I'm a big believer in that if you have the right artist for the right project, you are already well on your way to success. And so I am really glad to see that people have been responding to the work that we've been putting out. But there was a degree of needed confidence, knowing that the wind was at my back, knowing that we had the team in place and we had the right material to work with. And it's nice when you start a project and think, okay, this one's mine to lose. And I've been really fortunate that I think the last few projects I've been working on, I've had that feeling throughout.
Yeah, we were joking before we started taping about David Pepose becoming a rock star as a creator, but you're really not that. You're a really down to earth guy who's lucky to
Thank you.
rise up and do such things like Space Ghost and Speed Racer.
Yeah,
You did Captain Planet, right?
I did. Yes, I did.
How do you like balance all that out in your head without obviously letting it get to your head?
I think it always comes down to I feel very lucky and fortunate to have this job and to be able to do what I do. And I think that sense is what inspires me to get up every day and try to deliver the best work I possibly can. And sometimes that makes me a little bit of a pain in the butt to my editors or my collaborators when I'm like, hey, is there any way we can make this tweak, make this adjustment? Because even if they say no, even if they say that's not worth the time, I'm always like, at least I said something.
David
You
Pepose,
know,
problem child.
I'm sure my editors would agree. But I think beyond that, like in terms of juggling different projects, I think everyone's got a unique. But I've been fortunate that every book has something different to it. Space Ghost is it's like the kind of it's the core trio going from adventure to adventure, bad guy of the month. Whereas Captain Planet, by virtue of it being a larger cast, by virtue of it being set in our modern day in the real world. So there was allegory behind it. That's a longer kind of runway in terms of the structure of that story rather than the done in one approach. We did this as more of a traditional 6 issue origin story. Speed Racer, it's a sports book. And so there's no superpowers involved. The closest thing you have are the cars. And finding what's different about each book, I think helps keep it straight in my mind. It also helps every artist is different. Every artist has their own kind of tone and approach, which I think helps sort those things in my mind tonally. But yeah, I think I always try to do different things tonally as much as possible. Whereas a few years back, I was writing Moon Knight, City of the Dead, and Punisher, and The Devil That Wears My Face concurrently. And that was, I remember, a very tricky period because all of those books felt fairly similar tonally, like a grim, gritty, street level. And I was really fortunate that I was working with Marcelo Ferreira and Dave Wachter and Alex Cormack, and their styles are sufficiently different that it helped me find ways to differentiate a bit. But yeah, I like to be able to exercise different muscle groups. You don't just do arm day every day, like you switch it up. And you got to do your leg days. So I try to do that with my projects when possible, because that way, like when I'm feeling exhausted in a particular writing muscle group, I can then, all right, I've turned in that script and I can shift gears to something else and give those neural pathways a little bit of a chance to rest.
How do you balance between bringing some of the stuff that was core to Speed Racer back to the 60s and modernize it and making it appealing to both the older fans?
I think it comes down to a lot of it's my approach for these things. I am mid 80s trash. I guess really 90s trash by the time I was cognizant of things. And so when I've been offered these books, like I have a broad sense of, okay, here's what I think the emotional through line for a book like this might be. But I want to know the lay of the land. And so what I did for Space Ghost and what I did for Speed Racers, I watched every episode of that series to try to get a sense of, okay, what are the landmarks here? And what are the things that these episodes feel like bigger than some of the other episodes. And so getting a sense of what would somebody who's like a diehard fan of these properties, who's been with it for years and years, what would they expect? What if I had this amount of runway to tell Speed Racer stories, what would they feel disappointed if I did not hit? And something for Space Ghost, the sort of building to the Council of Doom kind of made sense in terms of that structure. And so that kind of gave me the guidepost to say, okay, I'm going to introduce each member of the Council of Doom individually before doing a supergroup. For Speed Racer, it was like, okay, like what characters really seem to pop? Like obviously, like in all cartoons that run for 50 plus episodes, not every episode is created equal. And so you're like, okay, but like, all right, Kim Jugger, that seems like somebody who's interesting. The Great Mammoth Car, all right, that's a big deal. The GRX engine, that was my favorite two-parter of the whole series. Okay, we can do something interesting there. And those are the kinds of characters that, like, you're as a writer, I think you're the prism a little bit. You're being force fed all this kind of information and lore, and it's up to you to interpret that and figure out by feel and of okay, this feels important, and what about this kind of catches my eye? What qualities stand out to me? And also in contrast to the main character. So, for example, I guess a mild spoiler for something coming out relatively soon is for our Great Mammoth Car issue that we have coming out in a few weeks. Speed's whole storyline is really it's an anti-capitalist thing because he's a guy who he has to win the Formula X League, otherwise his dad won't get the heart transplant he needs to save his life. So he's a broke kid who needs the money. And having Cruncher Block, who's a gangster figure behind the Great Mammoth Car, you see very quickly he crashes the Ocean Industries Gala, the Met Gala for Formula X racers, and you can tell from the jump he's got a chip in his shoulder about all these rich people who are congregating. They're hiding behind their lines of police cars, thinking that blue collar criminals like him can't touch them. And so for him, he goes on this kind of big score to steal something that he considers to be his nest egg. And that's not something that I had really thought of when I was putting together the broad strokes of it. But I was like, oh yeah, that's a very interesting contrast for Speed, who's a broke kid trying to make good. And then his villain is somebody who actually mirrors his own struggle a little bit. So those are things that, as you riff around when you're writing dialogue, those connections start to pop out at me a little bit. But I think ultimately I know that these series endured for a reason. And of course, it's a lot of it is the core concept. It's the main character, it's their powers, it's their ongoing kind of status quo adventures. But it's also the villains are the key landmarks here. And so I know, like, all right, if you're a longtime Speed Racer fan who watched it in the 60s, You know what the Great Mammoth car is. You know what the Melange is. And that's all the landmarks I need. And then I can reinterpret it in my own way. The older readers seem to really appreciate that we're still living up to the spirit of it, but finding a way to modernize it. And the younger readers who don't have those expectations are like, oh, that's interesting. That's a really cool thing that like they give me probably more credit than I deserve. And that that was something that I rolled the dice on with Space Ghost, and it seemed to really work very well. And so that's an approach that I've continued to try to take with my other licensed books as well. It's the J.J. Abrams Star Trek version of all this. I love that first movie. I can't really say the same for the next two movies, but that first movie, as somebody who didn't have a strong relationship with the Shatner original Star Trek as a Next Generation kid, I watched that movie and I was like, oh, I get it now. I get why people like Kirk, and I get why people like Spock, and I get why people find this cast interesting and enduring. And so that's, I think, a big Rosetta Stone for the way I try to approach a lot of these licensed properties.
So with the Speed Racer, do you have certain characters that you like more than others and that you see more story potential, or do they or they just kind of unroll their story as you go along?
Well, I think it's a matter of I want to make sure I really try to do my best to give each character their due. My goal is to not like let anybody linger for too long. It is an ensemble thing though. Speed is he's raw talent, but he's got a lot of rough edges that need to be smoothed out before he can hope to win the Formula X championship. And so Speed's evolution is really he's the product of everyone around him. And so that's that nice ensemble. You've got Spritel, who is like speed minus the trauma. And yes, he's maybe minus the racing talent. He's a little young for all of that. He's got the passion that Speed has, but it's not tarnished by this trauma of losing his brother because he was just too young to remember it. And the fact that like this motor mouth, who's a young color commentator, he's the one who, when Speed's at his worst, he's the kid who hypes him up. You've got Racer X, who, people who know what Speed Racer is, they know that is actually Speed's older brother Rex taking on kind of a secret identity. And so the idea of him being the opposite, where he is dark and jaded and he's left everything he's ever known and loved behind in theory to protect them. He sees Speed as like he's me minus my mistakes, and how can I keep him from making the same mistakes without blowing my cover. Trixie is really fun, and we've gotten to sort of play with her in a few different issues, with issue 2, and then in the two-parter with issues 4 and 5, and then issue 8 she really pops in a big way, as well as issues 9 and 10. But like she's the Carol Ferris to Speed's Hal Jordan. Like the idea of adding a little complication to that relationship, that there's this will they or won't they, like they're obviously drawn to each other, but she's also his boss. And how do they make that sort of thing work? And then Pops, I think Pops was sidelined quite a bit in the first arc, but is in our last two-parter with the GRX engine, like he's out of his coma. He's Speed's corner man. He's his coach. And seeing that kind of dynamic of you don't want to like squash your son's dreams, you don't want to squash his ambitions, but you want to keep him safe. And also when you know he's just being reckless, he's being hot-headed, there's a better way to do this. Pops and Speed are very similar. They've got that kind of similar temperament. I think it's just you cycle between the characters, and so much of what I do, if I feel like I do it by touch, like it's just does it feel right? And oftentimes I kind of Rubik's cube it until it clicks for me, and then I'm like, okay, this feels right. So there's not necessarily a big rhyme or reason. Like certain characters I knew just organically would work in a certain order. I knew that Spritel from the jump was going to be there because he's his brother, and of course he's just going to be there in the initial status quo. And I knew that people were going to want to see Racer X relatively early, and so we had teases of him for the first couple of issues. And Trixie is the heart of all this, and so introducing her early was important. And whereas like Pops, I knew we could introduce him at the jump, but then make him he's the core stakes of the whole book. So yeah, when you think of it like that, then not necessarily priority, but just the order of how you introduce everybody, that often answers the question for you.
Do you have an
Yeah.
end point where I'm done with my stories, maybe somebody else will take to it? And at the same time, can you give some of the fans an idea of what's coming up in the next few months without revealing too much and getting yourself into trouble?
Yeah, so my initial contract for Speed Racer is through issue 15. That at least that initial kind of storyline, we're about to hit our halfway point with that. But there's certainly, I know the response to the book has been really excellent. So there's certainly, I think there's a world where we could certainly do more of Speed Racer. There are certainly a few characters that we didn't get the chance to incorporate. That would be really nice if I got a second bite of that apple in the same way that I did with Space Ghost. There's certainly never say never. There's definitely possibilities. But it ultimately comes down, do we have the right story for more? And just what's the framework for all of this? And just my bandwidth. I've got a lot of books on the plate. And so I always want to make sure that if I'm going to continue in a book, it's because I have the bandwidth to do it right. I also have a baby on the way, so that's going to take up some of my time as well. So yeah, I think there could definitely be some room for more potentially after 15, but I will say 15 is going to be where like the end of this kind of meta arc wraps up in terms of Pops's hard issues in the Formula X Championship. But yeah, so then as far as things coming up, the Great Car will be showing up in this week's issue and Cruncher Block. And yeah, we'll be seeing a few other interesting things. We've got a story, a two-parter coming up after this issue called Demon on Wheels. That's a really fun one. I see that as the flip side of our GRX engine two-parter. Speed is going to face an unexpected opponent who might be his biggest danger to date. So that's going to be really interesting for all the cast. And then, yeah, we'll be seeing a few other iconic characters coming up. The Melange will be coming up in a few months, starting in issue 10. Or is that, no, sorry, issue 11. And then we'll be seeing the return of a really iconic Speed Racer villain that we've been teasing for a long time. But Dante Furno, the head of Alpha Automotive and the owner of the car acrobatic team, he used to have a different identity back during his own racing days as the ruthless Captain Terror. And we're going to see what happens when Dante decides enough's enough and he's going to take matters into his own hands. Yes, Captain Terror will return and he's going to put Speed through the ringer. He's the Red Baron of the racetrack. And so I'm very excited to get to work on that one. But those are going to be some really fun stories coming up for Speed and Company. And it's going to really, by the time we're done, I think we're going to hit some really interesting emotional notes for the character. And so I'm very excited.
David Pepose, current writer of the hit series Speed Racer from Mad Cave Studios. Issue 8 is going to come out exactly when the show airs. Hope you fans pick it up. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.